Imagine if your research could change the entire perceived history of something. That's what I'm hoping mine will do. In 1777, a woman from Mousehole called Dolly Pentreath died. So what, you might think, loads of people must have died in that year. However, with Dolly's death, something else also disappeared. Dolly Pentreath is the so-called last speaker of the Cornish language, and with her death, the language became extinct. Or did it? My PhD research is looking for evidence that people continued to use the Cornish language between Dolly Pentreath's death and the beginning of the language revival at the start of the 20th century. In the 19th century, the Cornish language was regarded as almost a museum exhibit. Several Victorian gentlemen antiquarians wrote papers on the language, although these tended to be reprints or translations of dictionaries and manuscripts written before 1777. In the second half of the century, Henry Jenner, a Cornishman working at the British Museum, did begin to research the language, and in 1904 he published his Handbook of the Cornish language, basically a history of the language and a grammar explaining its use. This book sparked the language revival, which is still ongoing today. However, even though he was Cornish, Jenner didn't spend time speaking to the ordinary working class people who might still have been using the language, and it is their lives which I'm trying to trace. Were people still using Cornish in their everyday lives? For example, we know that in 1877, the first Bishop of Truro, Edward Benson, gave a speech in Cornish commemorating the centenary of Dolly Pentreath's death. I'm currently trying to find a copy of this speech and discover who wrote it for him. I've also been researching the reasons for language death and how linguists define language as actually being extinct. We know from studying the decline of Cornish in the years before 1777 that the use of Cornish was retreating towards the far left of the county, the far west of the county, and the Lizard Peninsula. And so I'm going to be studying records from those geographical areas, as well as contemporary newspapers, to look for evidence of the language in use. Language decline normally follows a pattern. Normally the first generation are monolingual speakers of their community language. The next generation, or couple of generations, become bilingual speakers, and the final generation, the third generation, become monolingual speakers of the majority language, so in this case English. If I can find evidence that Cornish was indeed being used beyond the academic curiosity of gentlemen scholars in the 19th century, it could change our entire perception of both the history of the language, give credence to it and legitimise its use today, and counter accusations that it's actually a made-up language. I hope that my PhD studies will pave the way for further study of the Cornish language in higher education and lead to more people learning the language both at this level and within the wider community.